Before we begin, a couple of quick notes. Firstly, there is an extended version of this episode on my Patreon. It adds more detail to the modern part of the story, the excavation and the Egyptology. I removed it for time, but for those who are interested, it is available on Patreon. Link in the episode description. Also, I should make a quick disclaimer. This episode is violent. We are dealing with a grave and a history concerned with war, ancient wars that took place 4,000 years ago, but the scars of these battles are extremely visible in the bodies of those who participated. I'm not going to wallow in the violence, but I don't shy away from it either. This episode may not be suitable for all audiences. Please use discretion. Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast. Today, we begin a look back at one of Egypt's most chaotic eras. Between 2150 and 1950 BCE, the Nile Valley convulsed in conflicts and battles. Historians refer to this as the First Intermediate Period, a time of weak monarchs, powerful warlords, and brutal struggles. In this episode, we see the cost of such conflicts on the human beings involved. This episode comes to you on behalf of James Bowlby and Arthur Markham, both of whom joined my Patreon at the priest level tier. James, Arthur, you are far too kind. Thank you for your generosity and your support of the show. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. Onwards to ancient battlefields. Our story begins in 1926. An archaeological team was at work in the hills of Deir el-Bahari in Luxor. This is a valley west of the Nile, but facing towards the river. Deir el-Bahari, or the Monastery of the North, is famous for its temples, most notably the terrace monument of Hatshepsut. Constructed around 1480 BCE, Hatshepsut's temple dominates this desert bay, as was intended. But on the southern side of her monument, another temple stands proud. This structure is considerably older, around 2000 BCE. It belongs to the ruler Montu Hotep II. Montu Hotep, or the god Montu is satisfied, is a famous ruler within Egyptology. He is notable for achieving the reunification of Egypt, after the chaotic centuries that we call the First Intermediate Period. Around 2000 BCE, Montu Hotep and his followers led a campaign to reforge the Egyptian kingdom. They succeeded, and the temple that Montu Hotep erected in Deir el-Bahari commemorates his accomplished rule. In 1926, the archaeological team was clearing rubble and debris in the hills near Montu Hotep's temple. They had been at work for several years, under the leadership of an American scholar named Herbert Winlock. Now, in the month of Ramadan, they entered a sepulchre, a catacomb dug into the hillside and containing curious things. Within the tomb, the excavators found bodies, skeletal remains that once lay wrapped in bandages and linen. Now the corpses were disordered, plundered by robbers many centuries before. The tomb was a mess, but the excavators were prepared for that. They had actually found this monument 3 years earlier in 1923. But back then, at the height of public fever around the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, this grave, with its mouldering skeletons, seemed an inconsequential find. So Winlock and the team had left the tomb for future excavation. Now they returned, opening the monument once more, and they began to examine the bodies within. What they uncovered was a fascinating burial dating back almost 4,000 years. The stories that emerged were intimately connected with the reign of Montu Hotep II and that ancient period of civil war. From the start, The tomb was a mess. There were skeletal remains and bits of flesh lying everywhere, along with the strips of linen bandages that once wrapped the corpses. That linen was the focus of Winlock's attention. Like many scholars of his time, Winlock was especially interested in texts, and ancient mummy wrappings often had writing. They either had spells to protect and assist the dead, or at the very least they had labels like personal names or institutions that might be associated with the grave. Winlock hoped to find some writing on these torn and scattered bandages, and he gave his workers the gruesome task of digging through the bodies by hand to find the scraps of linen. Winlock offered a bonus for every piece that contained genuine ancient writing. He set the team to work, but he did not expect much in the way of results.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
A few hours later, Winlock's promise of a bonus payment came back to bite him. He had expected a few tiny scraps maybe, but well before lunchtime, the workers had found 60 pieces with writing on them. The result was a bill that, in today's money, would run approximately 230 British pounds, maybe $250. Not a huge sum, but far more than he had anticipated. Live and learn. Financial woes aside, the discovery of texts was exciting. Winlock and his assistants set to work identifying and deciphering all of these labels. Soon, they turned up some interesting results. Quote, "Long before noon that day, we had found 60 linen marks. Among them were 29 examples of a sign, which we and others had already found on sheets from the 11th dynasty tombs in this cemetery. On 26 other sheets, there were names current in Thebes or Luxor during the same period." End quote. So the linen marks confirmed Winlock's suspicion. The grave did in fact belong to the early Middle Kingdom, the 11th dynasty, around 2000 BCE. And now, Winlock was in possession of a whole host of bodies of individuals from that time. Which begged the question, who were these people? To whom did this tomb belong? From this point, events began to move quickly. Seeing the need for a medical examination, Winlock asked for a specialist to assess the tomb. That specialist was Dr. Douglas Derry. Derry was a prominent figure in 1920s Egyptology. It was he who performed the autopsy of King Tutankhamun's mummy in November 1925. Now, Winlock brought Derry back to examine his new find. Winlock and Derry set to work on the skeletal remains. The process of examining bodies was quite different to the work the team had been doing. Since most of the local tombs had been disturbed and robbed long ago, the workers had been confined to studying artifacts, stelae, coffins, and smaller objects. Now, things became more mortuary. As Winlock described it, quote, "Up to that time, our work tent had been a mere laboratory. From this moment onwards, it took on some of the gruesomeness of a field dressing station, that is, a military treatment center. Only the front was 4,000 years away." End quote. Winlock himself had served in the American artillery during the later years of the Great War. Now, just 10 years after that, he was back in action, so to speak. And the comment about a military field station was definitely well chosen, as the study of these bodies would reveal. As they worked through the remains, Winlock and Derry reached a few broad conclusions. Firstly, the tomb probably held 60 individuals in total, maybe a few more or less. Based on a quick examination, the bones were all male, and at least 2 bodies belonged to men of slightly higher status, for they lay within coffins made of sycamore wood and painted yellow on the outside. They may have been officers, overseers, or standard-bearers. Unfortunately, the coffins had no text or decoration beyond the simple colors, so their identities remained unknown. They were simply there. Regardless of number or sex, it did seem that the individuals who lay in this tomb were, during their lifetime, involved in war. Military equipment lay within the grave, including pieces of bows and arrows, more on that later, and a set of wrist guards used by archers. The guards were black leather, about 3 millimeters thick, with straps for attaching to the arm. 2 of these were lying amidst the detritus of the scrambled burial. Another was still in situ on the wrist of its owner. These arm guards are well preserved, and they are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where you can see them on their website catalogue. Link in the description. Anyway, the military equipment established the skeleton's identity, at least partially. They were probably soldiers serving in the army of an ancient king. Which king? Well, we'll come back to that. But the basics were there. 60-odd men lying in a collective tomb with traces of military equipment. How did they get there? Studying the bodies, one thing became clear. Many of these individuals, perhaps all of them, had fought and died in battle. Among the surviving bodies, at least the ones in decent condition, all of them had wounds, injuries received before, during, and after their death. Some of those wounds were fatal, others not, but out of these 60-plus bodies identified, almost all of them had some sort of damage. I should warn you, these injuries can be horrific. I don't want to wallow in the bloodshed, but some of the descriptions are truly brutal, and we won't shy away from them. So, gird your loins. We are entering the battlefield. First, there were the old wounds. Injuries received earlier in life, but which had mostly healed by the time the warrior died. 2 of them had shallow depressions in their skulls, where something hard had struck them and damaged the bone. The depressions ranged from 1.5 centimeters to 2.5 centimeters in diameter, about 0.7 inches wide. These depressions may have come from blows, perhaps an accident, totally unrelated to battle, or maybe the soldier was struck with a stone, a piece of wood, a mace, or the edge of a shield. The injury was not fatal. It did not fracture the skull or cause any significant damage, but it probably hurt like hell, and it left a lasting impression. 2 other skeletons showed proper fractures in their skull bones. One man received a, quote, crescent-shaped cut above his left eye. It was approximately 5 centimeters long and 3 centimeters wide, about 2 by 1 inches. Another had a fracture on his right cheekbone, the zygomatic arch, and an old fracture on the right side of his head, just above the sphenoid bone. Both injuries had healed long before he died, but this man, apparently, had gone through the ringer more than once. On the lighter end of the spectrum, there were the flesh wounds, injuries that cut the soft tissue but did not penetrate deeply. There were a few of these visible in the remains. One man had suffered a hernia in the umbilical region of his stomach. Winlock and Derry could not say whether it was ante-mortem, before death, or post-mortem, after, but it may have been caused by stress or a buildup of gas in the torso. Another body had a gash on the left side between 2 of his ribs. The wound was long, about 7.5 centimeters, and it showed signs of healing. The edges of the wound had turned inward, and a thick blood clot had filled the space. The wound was wide, not deep, and to Winlock it appeared to be a glancing injury, probably caused by an arrow or dagger slashing past the warrior. Maybe the soldier was turning to avoid an opponent when the weapon cut him in the side, but the gash, at least, was not the killing blow. Those men were lucky, at least for a while, but they, and the other bodies in the tomb, had eventually met their fate. Of the 60-plus corpses lying in the grave, 45 had visible, fatal wounds. These killing blows ranged in size and severity, and they came from a variety of different weapons. I will describe a few, but I must warn you, they are brutal. First, there were the arrow wounds. At least 10 soldiers had suffered injury from long wooden missiles. We know that for 2 reasons. Firstly, the size and shape of the wounds are consistent with arrows, and secondly, Many of the arrows were still embedded in the bodies. One skeleton had an arrow jutting out of his neck. It had come from above, pierced his collar, and gone through his torso before poking out between his ribs. The funeral party had broken the arrow where it emerged from his neck, but they did not withdraw the whole thing. After centuries of decay, the dart was still visibly embedded. Ouch. Another man had an arrow piercing his left lung and heart. The wound was still stained with blood. From the position of the arrow and impressions on the body, Derry and Winlock determined that the man was hit and then, quote, fell forward on his face. Later, the burial party had broken the arrow shaft and removed what they could, but the rest of it remained, driven through his chest. A third man suffered the Harold Godwinson treatment. An arrow had struck him in the eye, hitting his left socket and penetrating the back of his nose. He might have survived that one, though in great pain. Alas, another arrow plunged into the soldier's neck. This dart was found still embedded in a small hole on the right side of his neck. The soldier must have been facing his enemy, either on the field or before the walls, and at some terribly unlucky moment, 2 arrows hit him, one from the left penetrating his eye, the other from the right plunging into his neck. It was the second arrow that killed him, for the sharpened tip ruptured a blood vessel. The soldier fell, hemorrhaging blood. Death, hopefully, came on swift wings. Other skeletons bore arrow wounds, including one that pierced a soldier's lung. Another man had arrows that probably hit him after he fell or was lying on the ground. And yet another had an arrow wound right on the side of his head. It had pierced the coronal structure, the side of the skull, and according to Winlock and Derry, the injury, quote, might have been made by an arrow striking squarely on the head with considerable velocity. The arrow punctured the skull and presumably the brain. Chances are, the soldier was dead before he hit the ground. Beyond the arrows, there was evidence for other missile damage. These were probably caused by stones, hurled from a great height, maybe defenders on a wall or slingers of some sort, but several of the bodies were killed by blunt, fast-moving objects. One man had a deep cut, about 6 centimeters long, on his scalp. The impact seems to have come from the rear, striking him on the back of the head. Perhaps the soldier had been standing before the walls, or slightly back from the melee. He had turned, just for a moment, to check his surroundings or speak with a colleague. Suddenly, a heavy thud, and the man fell forward. Whether he died right away or after a long collapse is unclear, but the stone did its work. Other skulls showed severe damage to their faces and the back of the head. They had fractures in the nasal bones, the jaws, the eye sockets, or orbital margins, and the upper jaw, the maxilla. In total, at least 14 soldiers had died from heavy stone missiles. In Winlock and Derry's estimation, the injuries largely came from, quote, above and in front. Working backwards from that, the soldiers may have been facing a wall or an area of high ground when the missiles came upon them. Perhaps they were in a siege, climbing ladders. That might explain the chap hit with arrows from the left and the right. Or perhaps they were facing an enemy who held a piece of high ground, like a cliff, and as the melee unfolded, the stones came flying. Whatever the exact context, these men had suffered devastating blows. Finally, there were the other wounds. Killing blows caused not by missiles, arrows, or stones. Rather, these wounds were personal, inflicted in a melee or soon after the fight. At least 15 of the soldiers had died in this manner. Their wounds are especially brutal. One skeleton showed a vicious fate. First, the man had received an arrow in his arm. The dart had pierced his right bicep muscle, and it was still embedded in his flesh when the tomb was discovered. That wound was probably disabling, but unlikely to be fatal. Instead, it was the next injury that ended his life. The man's head was severely damaged. The nose, left eye socket, cheekbone, and upper jaw were all completely smashed. Bone fragments had collapsed into the body, and these were stained with blood. The blow probably came from a mace, which struck the man on the left side of his head. It was a very palpable hit, one that likely killed him quickly. Another skeleton suffered similar treatment. His face was crushed on the left-hand side. All the bones from his nose, lower eye socket, and the palate of his upper mouth were smashed in, broken, and pushed into the skull. The fractured surfaces were stained with blood, and the killing blow was so powerful that it even fractured the other side of the skull. On the right sphenoid bone, in the middle of the skull on the side, just next to the eye socket, Winlock and Derry observed a clear fracture. In other words, the enemy hit this man so hard on the left that it damaged him on the right. Alternatively, the fracture might have come when the body fell onto its side, perhaps the head striking a stone or weapon. Either way, the killing blow was fierce. A third skeleton had a brutal set of injuries. Again, his face was crushed on the left side. His cheekbones had caved inwards from the blow, pushing the bones up into the eye socket. The jawbone had shattered into 3 pieces, and the tip of the jaw was entirely detached. The man's skin, which survives, bulges with an enormous blood clot on the right side of the face. The fractured jaw is stained with blood. The man died horribly. Finally, one soldier had a particularly bad day. An arrow had struck him on the left side of his face. Then, a melee blow had come, hitting so hard that his face had, quote, broken free from the cranium and crushed inwards. Truly, a horrible fate for anyone. These are just a few of the killing blows. Others follow the same pattern: heavy fractures on the skulls, crushed bones on the faces and crania. According to Winlock, most of these killing blows came from blunt weapons, probably a mace, a piece of stone lashed to a stick and wielded with great force. We can't say for sure, but we can make an educated guess. Some of these smaller, better preserved wounds are approximately 4.5 centimeters long. Coincidentally, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a mace head of that exact size in their collection. That mace head comes from another excavation, not this tomb, but it dates to the same general period, and we know from Egyptian art that such weapons were common in battle. So at least some of the skeleton's wounds are consistent with a weapon like that. One question lingers around these wounds. When did they happen? Were they received in combat, in a melee, or did they come after, execution-style blows to defeated prisoners? Well, looking at the skeletons overall, the melee answer seems more likely. Many of the bodies have fractures on their arms, the sort that you might receive from a blow to a shield, or if you were raising your arm to fend off an attacker. Additionally, most of the crushing blows are on the side of the head, around the face. That suggests that the enemy, of roughly equal height, swung their weapon hard and caught the side of the skull. Working backwards, that suggests that the warriors were standing on their feet when they received the death strike. If they had been executed following a defeat, we would expect wounds higher up on the body, the upper portion or top of the cranium. Why would we expect that? Well, Egyptian art is full of images dealing with the execution of prisoners. In these scenes, we consistently find the prisoners kneeling before their captors. They are usually bound or held firm by the hair and head. Then, the victor raises their weapon high to strike down upon the skull. It's the classic smiting pose that you will find on artifacts and temples all across the land. Granted, art and reality are 2 different things, but even if we allow for some divergence, it would still be easier to kill a prisoner when they are on the ground, preferably tied up, before striking home. Of course, that is educated speculation at best, but the skeletons do show a consistent pattern. The killing wounds tend to be lower down on the head, and they have injuries on the arms as if they were resisting. Put that together with the arrow wounds and the wounds from stone missiles, and we might be able to reconstruct the scenario. Whether struck down in melee combat or killed by distant volleys, most of these warriors probably died on their feet. Perhaps that is some comfort to their colleagues, friends, and families. Finally, the battle wounds remind us of one last point. The crushing injuries inflicted on the skulls and bones are a stark reminder of how powerful ancient weapons could be. Even around 2000 BCE, as the Bronze Age was truly underway, weapons of wood and stone remained viable and fearsome. We should not underestimate their power or their terrifying impact. The mortal wounds are terrible indeed. The soldiers fell in chaos and blood. Alas, their injuries did not end with their deaths. The bodies show many signs of lying on the battlefield for a few hours at least. The wounds are caked with sand, some of which found its way into the cavities. Rigor mortis had started on a few bodies, slowly hardening the limbs. And worst of all, many corpses bear the mark of scavengers. At some point, soon after the battle, carrion birds gathered on the field. These may have been vultures or kite birds, and they feasted on the soldiers' fallen corpses. The birds attacked the limbs and torsos of the deceased. In one case, they went for the calf muscle on the right leg. The skin and flesh were gone from the corpse, ripped away, quote, from the knee to the foot. The metatarsal bones were scraped clean, and some of the toes had disappeared entirely. In another case, the birds had fed on the arms and legs of the deceased, quote, from the hips to the soles of the feet. All soft parts had been shredded out from among the tendons. In a third case, perhaps the grisliest, the birds had, quote, ripped open the warrior's chest and abdomen. They pecked at the body from the base of the sternum and tore a ragged hole in the abdominal wall. Truly a horrific aftermath for anyone. From the surviving remains, it seemed that at least 6 of the bodies had suffered such damage. Probably more, but the overall condition of the tomb and the decay of the soft flesh meant that only 6 were certain. In Winlock's assessment, the wounds were consistent with those caused by vultures or kite birds, and given the extent of the damage, the rigor mortis setting in on some bodies, and the overall condition, it seems likely that the dead soldiers lay on the battlefield for at least a couple of hours. Fortunately, it was not too long, and soon a burial party came to remove the bodies, treat them, and take them to their grave. Unfortunately, that part of the story is murkier than you might expect. Following their deaths in battle, the soldiers lay on the field for some time before they were removed for treatment and burial. The next part of the story is surprisingly murky. The excavator Winlock had some very strong ideas about the overall context, but in the decades since, scholars have raised numerous and important questions. The history of this grave is not quite as clear-cut as we would like. After the break, we will explore the big questions around this burial. Who were these soldiers exactly? Where did they come from? Which king did they serve? And what was the battle that ultimately caused their deaths? We will explore these questions and the scholarly debates around them, and then we will bring it all together to try to reconstruct that one unfortunate day. That is after the break. See you in a moment. One unfortunate day, about 4,000 years ago, a group of Egyptian soldiers lay dead upon a battlefield. Their bodies had fallen to arrows, stones, and violent melee combat. Now, lying in the sand, the corpses twitched as carrion birds pecked at their remains. What happened next is a matter of some uncertainty. A couple of the corpses had stiffened severely as rigor mortis set in, but others hadn't. At a glance, that might suggest the corpses were recovered quickly, within 2 to 3 hours. Unfortunately, that's only part of the story. Rigor mortis is a phase, but not a permanent one, and the speed at which it sets in or disappears can vary depending on climate and circumstances. So the bodies may have laid on the field for a couple of hours, or maybe a couple of days. Perhaps the shorter timescale is appropriate, since the carrion birds only attacked a few parts. Logically, if they had longer, they would have eaten more. Since the bodies are largely free of scavenging, we'll go with the shorter time frame, but that is speculation on my part. At any rate, the birds eventually scattered at the calls of living humans approaching the site. A group of Egyptians, perhaps soldiers themselves, came to collect the dead. The bodies were recovered quickly and prepared for burial. Notably, the corpses did not receive mummification. There is no evidence for the embalming process or preservation of the bodies. The funeral party may have buried the corpses temporarily in sand to help dry them out, but they did not do any of the standard mummification process. Instead, the soldiers' colleagues collected their remains, wrapped them in bandages, and took them away for interment. The wrapping may have happened on the battlefield. The wounds were still caked with sand and dried blood, and pieces of weapons, like a broken bow and arrow, were tied up within some of the wrappings. So this could have happened in the same place where the soldiers died. The soldiers' bodies went into their tomb relatively quickly. In fact, they were kind of piled up one atop another, which speaks to a relatively swift process. That could be inaccurate. The tomb had been violated by robbers in later centuries. Those robbers cut open the bandages and rifled through them, scattering many pieces of the burial. So it is entirely possible that the soldiers originally lay in a more orderly fashion, but were thrown about by the intruders later. Unfortunately, that is as much as we can say, really, about the after-death treatment. The condition of the tomb and the bodies within was far worse than we would like, and that makes it very difficult to answer certain questions. The tomb of the unknown warriors is complicated for several reasons. The main problem is the interpretation. Who were these warriors? When did they die? Which king did they serve? And where was the battle in which they fell? In 1926, Herbert Winlock had answers to all of these questions, and he argued them strongly in his publication of the tomb. But 100 years later, those answers are far less secure than Winlock may have liked. We're about to explore the detective side of Egyptology, the crime scene investigation that all excavations and studies must engage. So wash your hands, grab a brush, and let's sift through the evidence. Starting with the tomb. The monument in which these bodies lay is a rock-cut tomb, that is, a grave dug into the bedrock of the cliffs. It has a long corridor going into the hill, with small rooms branching off to the left and right. Architecturally, the tomb is similar to others in the area and of the same period. Nothing remarkable there. But we shouldn't assume that the tomb and the soldiers within it are contemporary. The monument itself probably wasn't built for the soldiers. For one thing, the bodies were not cleanly separated into the different side chambers. They were piled up in the corridor and a couple of rooms. That speaks of haste, as if the funeral party had taken a pre-existing tomb and reused it for the soldiers. That may sound surprising. Why would anyone let their tomb be repurposed for someone else? Well, it does happen occasionally. Throughout Egyptian history, there are cases where people would commission a tomb, but then abandon it for another location, resulting in multiple tombs for a single person. So we can't rule that scenario out. This monument was certainly carved already when the soldiers themselves died. Apparently, the soldiers' comrades took over this monument to use for the burial. There was no time to cut a new monument, which would take months at least. Chances are, the burial party gathered their dead and brought them to the closest available grave. The bodies themselves all belong to the same historical period. They are all preserved and wrapped in the same fashion, and there is no evidence for multiple burials, adding new bodies later on. The tomb itself was well sealed, although at some point a couple of centuries later it had been entered and robbed. Following that, A rock slide had covered the entrance to the tomb, leaving it completely intact from its ancient condition. So the soldiers went into the grave was sealed, and at some point a bit later it was entered and robbed. But after that, it was closed for good, until its discovery in the 1920s. That gives us a relatively secure context for the bodies themselves. The corpses probably belonged to soldiers who fought and died in battle. There was the military equipment, including bows and wrist guards, among their wrappings, and most of the soldiers had suffered grievous wounds that led to their deaths. Since they were all buried together at the same time, it seems reasonable to conclude that these warriors died in the same battle, or at least the same campaign, and they were all interred here together. Surprisingly, that is the limit of our certainty, the conclusions which are beyond reasonable doubt. From there, everything else gets complicated. Let's start with a basic question. Who are these warriors? We're not sure, but we can make some educated guesses, starting with names. Winlock's team did find plenty of inscriptions amid the bones and flesh. The fragments of linen which wrapped the bodies bore labels in the ancient Egyptian language. When translated, many of these texts included names. There were 25 names to be found amidst the wreckage. I won't quote all of them, but here are a couple of examples. Quote, Ameni, the son of Hesi. Sobek Nakt, the houndsman or dog trainer. Sen Useret, the son of Ameni, the son of Kawa. Sa Ipu, who is born of Memi. Montu Hotep, born of Hejret. Sehetep-ib Sobek, the son of Redi Sobek. Ameni, born of Hen-Memi. End quote. That is just a small sample. You get an idea of the names that appear. They include theophoric names, names that reference a god, and names that reference parents, so-and-so, son of so-and-so. One of these names references a job title, the houndsman or dog trainer, which is Chesem. Put them together and you get a basic cross-section of Egyptian names around 2000 BCE. One notable feature of the names is the gods who are referenced. We hear about Amun in the name Ameni, Montu in the name Montu Hotep, and Sobek in the name Sehetep-ib Sobek or Redi Sobek. These are all mighty and prominent deities with rich histories, but they do have something in common. These three deities, Amun, Montu, and Sobek, were all especially prominent in the south. Amun and Montu had major shrines at Waset, modern Luxor, and Sobek had a cult center at Jebel Silsila, Gebelin, and Komombo, all of which are in the southern regions. These aren't the only places in which these deities are important. Sobek was also famous in the north, but there is definitely a southern trend overall. That might tell us something about the army in which these soldiers served. The troops probably came from a variety of towns scattered across the region, not just one major center. They likely had a variety of backgrounds, some rural, living in farming villages, some from the quarry regions, and others perhaps from the major city, Waset itself. I'm speculating there, but the references to different gods, each of whom have their own shrines and centers, might give us clues to the broader social background. We can't say which name belongs to which skeleton. The burial was so disorderly, ransacked by robbers, that the pieces were scattered all over. Just finding the inscriptions required the team to sift through the entire mess slowly and carefully. What's more, the wrappings themselves are not what you would call traditional mummy bandages. Instead of long strips, they are more like wider pieces of cloth cut from clothing or sheets. In fact, Winlock actually thought the linen might be bedclothes, blankets, and sheets taken from the army's storehouses. And on that basis, he suggested that the names probably had nothing to do with the individuals themselves, that they were simply part of a collection of linen which was used to bury these bodies. That is a fair point. I'm not going to argue with it. But at the very least, the names do give us something to build a story around. even if we can't say this body is Ameni and that body is Sobek Nagt, we could at least imagine the soldiers having names along these lines. So the names on the linen have a visible southern trend. That isn't definitive, but it suggests that the warriors served an army coming from the south. Overall, that makes total sense. The grave of these soldiers is located at Deir el-Bahri, west of Luxor, or ancient Waset. Around 2000 BCE, Waset was the home of a royal house, which we refer to as the 11th dynasty. A dynasty whose most famous ruler is King Montuhotep II, a king who just so happens to have a temple at Deir el-Bahri, not far from this tomb. With that in mind, Wenlock concluded that the soldiers belonged to the army of Montuhotep himself. He was so confident of this conclusion that he titled the final publication, The Slain Soldiers of Neb-Hepet-Ra Mentuhotep. What's more, Wenlock argued that these soldiers had participated in Montuhotep's campaign to reunify Egypt. He even suggested that the soldiers themselves actually died in the final battles or sieges in the north. Wenlock's logic went as follows. The tomb was located near the temple of Montuhotep, so the soldiers must have been favored or honored. The men had died from Egyptian-style weapons, particularly the arrows, so they were fighting a battle within Egypt against local enemies. And the texts written on the bandages were consistent with the period of Montuhotep's reign. Finally, the injuries on some of the warriors pointed to a death-from-above situation, as if they had died in a siege. As Wenlock put it, quote, "There must have been a very good reason for honoring these men above all others who were killed in the wars. They must have fallen in some great and glorious feat of arms, putting up scaling ladders or sapping the walls of a fortress. For this, they were shown the signal honor of a tomb to themselves overlooking Montuhotep's temple. Unless I am much mistaken, that stronghold at which they died was Heracleopolis itself, the residence of the pharaoh who was conquered by the forces of Montuhotep." End quote. Wenlock placed his fallen heroes at the very climax of the first intermediate period, the siege of Heracleopolis, the northern bastion, when Montuhotep, king of the south, defeated his rivals and reunified the two lands. That is, well, that's quite a stretch beyond the reliable details from the tomb. But Wenlock argued his point with confidence, and in the absence of anything to contradict him, this interpretation made its way into the wider scholarship. The tomb faded into the background, and everyone got on with their work. Until the 21st century. In 2003, a scholar named Dr. Carola Vogel of the Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz in Germany re-examined the evidence for this grave. This included a review of Wenlock's published work and his excavation notes held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The result was, well, rather different from Wenlock's conclusions. Vogel's examination agreed that the skeletal remains were almost certainly soldiers. They had died in battle, undergone a hasty cleaning and wrapping, and then been interred in their grave. Their service and ultimate death had occurred sometime around 2000 BCE at the earliest. But there, things diverged. As Vogel went through the evidence, Wenlock's interpretation became far less convincing. The discussion is quite academic, I won't drown you in the details, but the gist of it goes as follows. Firstly, the date. Wenlock had argued that the soldiers served in the army of Montuhotep II, part of the victorious legion that reunified Egypt around 2000 BCE. Okay, the rough date might be accurate. The soldiers possibly belong to that general phase of history. But after 4,000 years, it can be hard to identify one decade or another with great certainty. In other words, the soldiers probably died around 2000 BCE, but how close can we really pinpoint them? 2030? 1950? The skeletons have not been carbon dated, and even if they were, we could get a range of dates, but it's nearly impossible to say they died in this specific reign. With that in mind, the soldiers probably died around the reign of Montuhotep, but the exact date could vary by decades. That is important because Montuhotep II is not the only king to have led wars or engaged in conflicts during this era. For over a century before Montuhotep took power, the Nile Valley had convulsed in conflicts and battles. And within just a few decades of Montuhotep's death, the 11th dynasty itself collapsed or was violently pushed aside, and a new dynasty, the 12th, took its place. That is a story for the future, but you get the point. The period from 2050 BCE to 1950 BCE was full of intermittent conflicts. Realistically, the soldiers could have died in any one of those. Okay, but what about the writing? The texts on the linen bandages were all appropriate for the 11th dynasty, right? Well, again, yes, but not exclusively. Looking more closely, the writing fits that period generally, but there is nothing to connect it with a specific ruler or phase. None of the bandages on the bodies referenced a particular king, and the soldiers' names are quite generic. You could find similar names throughout the entire Middle Kingdom, between 2000 and 1700 BCE. In fact, Fergal argued that the names of these soldiers might actually hint at a death and burial during the 12th dynasty, the age of Amenemhat I, Senuseret I, and so forth. In Fergal's argument, some of the soldiers' names, like Sehetep-Ib and Keper-Ka, might invoke the names of those later rulers, Sehetep-Ibra for Amenemhat I and Keper-Kara for Senuseret I. I'll come back to that in a moment, but Fergal's point is clear and concise. When you really look at what is in the tomb, there is a very large gap where the history is concerned. As Dr. Fergal herself puts it, quote, "From the evidence, it is difficult to conclude with certainty where and when the soldiers of Deir el-Bahri met their deaths. However, it is unlikely that they died in the storming of Heracleopolis, as Winlock proposed, if this historical event ever took place at all." End quote. Fergal was not in the business of demolishing heroes, though. The examination did put forth some alternative possibilities for the soldiers' death and burial. Firstly, the location of their deaths. Winlock had argued for the siege of Heracleopolis, but that is several hundred kilometers north of the tomb at Deir el-Bahri, and looking at the condition of the bodies, their hasty cleaning, wrapping, and burial, it seems unlikely that they died so far away. After all, if you're going to ship them several hundred kilometers upriver, wouldn't you take the time to properly preserve them first? It's not a definitive argument, but it's a logic point. The haste of the soldiers' preparation and burial seems incongruous with a northern battle and death. So Fergal suggested that they had actually died much closer to Deir el-Bahri itself, perhaps a battle in the region of Waset or Thebes, or in the southern lands generally. As we'll see in the coming episodes, the late First Intermediate period, around 2000 BCE, and the beginning of the 12th dynasty, around 1950 BCE, both saw conflicts in this general region. It is entirely possible that these warriors died much closer to their political home. Maybe they were not heroes of the reunification. Perhaps they fell in a political bloodbath. That argument was speculative. Fergal was just making the point. When you really look at what we know, the history of these soldiers and the circumstances of their death are far murkier than we would like. And that leaves us in a difficult position. How do we tell the story of these men who clearly died in violent circumstances? How do we describe them if we don't know when or where their deaths occurred? We can answer some questions with reasonable confidence. We know how the soldiers died, the weapons that killed them, and we know the general time period in which they lived. The details are beyond our current knowledge, and to narrow the date more specifically, that would require a lot more data than we currently have. Perhaps more data than survives in the bones themselves. Ultimately, the best that we can hope for is a new examination, a new analysis of the skeletal remains. That was the conclusion that Dr. Carola Vogel reached, and it is one that I agree with. But that begs the question, where are the bodies themselves? In his publication of the tomb, Winlock does not mention the ultimate fate of the remains. He describes everything within the tomb, provides plans and photos, but the removal of the bodies and their final destination? Very little mention. We know a few fragments did wind up in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as part of the division of finds between the Antiquities Service and the museum that was funding the dig. You can find references to these bones on the Metropolitan Museum of Art website, and I'll include links in the description. But that is just a few fragments. It may surprise you to learn that most of the bodies are probably still in the grave, still lying in the chambers in which they were originally discovered. That is, according to Dr. Vogel, who, in a footnote of her 2003 study, mentions, quote, "The skeletons were reburied at their original location, and I have to thank Dr. Dorothea Arnold for this information. An anthropological re-examination would be very useful." End quote. So apparently, the bodies had laid there since 1926, with no one the wiser. That may sound hard to believe. Wouldn't they be removed and put in storage at least? But in 2014, we got confirmation. The bodies were still there. In August of 2014, a new archaeological project began in the Deir el-Bahari Hills. It is called the Middle Kingdom Theban Tomb Project, and the goal is explicitly to re-examine these ancient monuments, to re-document them, conserve them, and hopefully republish them. As part of their initial exploration, the project team received permission to open and investigate several tombs. This included the Monument of the Soldiers. And to their great surprise, the tomb still contained the bodies left by Winlock's team. So there we have it. The bodies remain in their tomb, awaiting new examination. For a long while, I thought that was the end of the story. But I was wrong. There is one more chapter. As part of the research for this episode, I reached out to the MKTP directly to ask them if they had any updates on the tomb. To my surprise, the head of the project, Professor Antonio Morales, responded with some details. I learned that while the MKTP made a preliminary investigation in 2014, the Ministry of Antiquities did not give permission for a new excavation and analysis. Subsequently, that permission was granted to a different excavation. The Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology re-entered this grave in the late 2018 and early 2019 season. Their survey was preliminary to assess the status of the monument, but sure enough, they found the remains of skeletons and linen lying in the tomb. The monument is in poor condition, the ceiling is damaged, and it needs reinforcement. In the brief time available, the team checked the remains and prepared for future work. The conclusions went as follows. Quote, "A preliminary reconnaissance by the Polish team demonstrated the need to undertake a cleaning of the interior and securing the rock ceiling, which is loose and in danger of collapse. The remains of corpses of slain soldiers were observed, although in a much smaller number than when Winlock described it over 70 years ago. In addition, the assemblage included no skulls, which clearly suggests that the main diagnostic material had been removed from the tomb. Nevertheless, the tomb still contained a large number of torn linen bandages." End quote. The project lead, Dr. Patrick Chudzik, noted the poor condition of the monument and that urgent work was necessary to reinforce and clear the remains. That task is, presumably, ongoing at the time of writing. I reached out to the Polish team for more information, but unfortunately, I learned of their work quite late in the research for this episode, and at the time of recording, I haven't received a reply. Rest assured, as soon as I do, I will update this episode. For now, this is where the tomb's story ends. The soldiers lay in their grave, at least until 2019. Now, a new excavation and analysis is underway. Hopefully, these studies will help to clarify the lives and deaths of these ancient warriors. We may not get hard dates, like did they serve under Montuhotep II or Senuseret I, but we will certainly get more information about their physical health, their livelihoods, and perhaps more information about the battles in which they fell. The future is bright for this forgotten tomb, brighter than it has been for a century. Hopefully, I can update you before too long. "4,000 years ago, a group of Egyptian soldiers had a very bad day. Engaged in a battle, perhaps a siege or in the open field, they faced an enemy that was well prepared and put up a violent fight. For some of the soldiers, death came from above, as arrows and stones descended upon them, puncturing their torsos or crushing their heads. Other soldiers waded into the melee, facing off against their enemy in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Some of these men fell on the battlefield, their bones broken by heavy blows, and their faces shattered by maces. It was a horrible way to die, but one that was certainly quite common in this historical period. The soldiers' enemies were almost certainly another Egyptian faction, wielding similar weapons to them. They fought, as so many others had, for control of the wider Nile Valley, as Egyptian society convulsed in frequent civil conflicts. When and where did they serve? That is unknown. Perhaps they marched in the army of Montuhotep II as he pushed northward and slowly reunified the two lands. Or maybe they served a later ruler, like Amenemhat or Senuseret, who waged bloody civil war to seize control of the kingdom and establish a new rule. The exact context remains unknown, and probably will until new evidence appears. But whichever king they served, whatever the cause for which they fought, these soldiers all suffered a similar fate. They died in battle, killed by their fellow countrymen. The grave of the unknown soldiers is a curious monument. In some ways, we know less about it now than we did in the 1920s, or at least the conclusions that Winlock reached can no longer be fully supported on the evidence and current scholarship. The tale of these soldiers is certainly not over, and hopefully future excavations and analyses will reveal new aspects about their lives and their deaths. For now, this is where our story comes to its end. If we could go back 4,000 years, the tale of these unknown warriors would probably be quite familiar to many people living in Egypt. Between 2200 and 2000 BCE, the first intermediate period, the Nile Valley witnessed countless campaigns and battles between rival rulers. Some of those campaigns and battles are remarkably well recorded, and thanks to newer scholarship, we do have greater insights into this period than we did just a few years ago. In the next episodes, we are going to go deeper into the context of this period, the battles that unfolded across the Nile Valley, both on land and on water. We are going to visit, or revisit, the tombs of prominent individuals who participated in these events. And we are going to see how it all comes together in a period of great violence and conflict. Join me soon for the next series of episodes, in which we explore an age of battle. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. I hope you have enjoyed this deep dive into an ancient monument and burial, and I hope the description of war wounds was not too extreme for you. I often feel uncomfortable describing such things in too much detail, since we are essentially profiting from their suffering. But we should also acknowledge the realities of ancient conflict, and sometimes there is no shying away from the brutality. At any rate, I hope it was educational and not too bloody or squeamish. Before we leave, I must thank my supporters on patreon.com. I would especially like to thank the priests who, in May of 2024, are Arthur, James, Veronica, Ashley, Neden, Kyla, Evan, Andy and Chelsea, Mykost, Yola, TJ, Terry, Eric, and Linda. As always, folks, thank you for your generous support. And thank you, dear listener, for joining me. I hope the great god Montu, Lord of War, and Sekhmet, Lady of Destruction, will keep you and your loved ones safe from any calamity. May you enjoy victory in all your pursuits. I'll see you soon.